So just starting with the basics, what exactly is fiscal sponsorship? Well, in short, fiscal sponsorship is a formal arrangement in which an existing tax-exempt organization, usually a 501c3, serves as a fiscal sponsor by entering into an agreement with an individual, a group, or an organization that's seeking to conduct a charitable project that itself does not have tax-exempt status. The individual, group, or organization conducting the charitable project or the project itself is called the sponsored project, or we could also call it the sponsee. And as we'll discuss, the sponsored project can itself either be legally incorporated or not. There are two different models, and we'll talk about those differences. And the whole idea behind entering into a fiscal sponsorship is that the sponsee can take advantage of the tax-exempt status of the sponsor without itself having to go to the IRS to seek its own 501c3 status. Effectively, by sponsoring the individual organization or group, the fiscal sponsor agrees to take that project under the wing of its 501c3 status and allow that project to be able to receive tax-deductible donations or donations from private foundations that do not need to have exercise expenditure responsibility. In order to do that, the fiscal sponsor must first determine that the sponsored project furthers the sponsor's own tax-exempt purposes. Otherwise, by taking in the sponsee, the sponsor could be engaging in activities that are contrary to its own tax-exempt status, which could jeopardize that status. So usually there's a period of due diligence to make sure that the project furthers the sponsor's own tax-exempt purpose. This service is, of course, usually done by the sponsor in return for a fee, compensating the fiscal sponsor for all of the administration, overhead, and oversight that it has to engage in over its new fiscally sponsored project. I also want to quickly mention that there are a number of different kinds or models of fiscal sponsorship. Greg Colvin of the Adler Colvin Law Firm has even written a book called Fiscal Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right. So by his estimation, there are at least 6 different models, but there are really 2 that are most common in the nonprofit landscape. And the most common one is the one that Colvin calls Model A, or what other people call comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, or the direct project model. And that's when a sponsored project has not incorporated itself into a separate legal entity. It's really still in the phase where it's an individual or group of individuals who want to engage in a project or have started a project. And then by entering into a fiscal sponsorship agreement with a fiscal sponsor, that project becomes comprehensively fiscally sponsored by the sponsor, which means that essentially the project gets adopted by the legal entity that is sponsoring it, and they become effectively a program or division or component part of the fiscal sponsor. So they don't have any separate legal existence apart from the fiscal sponsor. So what's great about that is that project doesn't have a whole separate legal corporation to take care of. There are no separate state filings, tax returns, accounting. All of that is taken care of by the fiscal sponsor, since it's a part of the fiscal sponsor. And the fiscal sponsor that is comprehensively sponsoring it takes on responsibility for the project in its totality, assuming liability for paying all the project's bills directly. If the project has any employees, those become the sponsor's employees. And if they have any volunteers, those are the sponsor's volunteers. That's the most common form. The other common form, and Carl will be talking more about that, quite a bit about Model A, that relationship. The other common model, although less common, is Model C, which is known as the pre-approved grant relationship model. That's where the sponsored project has already been separately incorporated. But for whatever reason, that organization does not have 501c3 status. It could be because they can't get 501c3 status. Maybe they're a for-profit, but they do engage in specific projects that further charitable purposes. Or perhaps they're an artist that sells their work on a for-profit basis, but they also engage in certain artistic projects that, say, private foundations or donors might want to support. Or maybe they are a nonprofit on their way to becoming a 501c3, but during the period where they're waiting to hear back from the IRS, they want to be able to hold fundraisers and fundraise tax-deductible donations. So they enter into a fiscal sponsorship Model C type relationship, and essentially the sponsor also needs to make sure that they further their project, furthers the sponsor's tax-exempt purposes. And then essentially the sponsor will fundraise for that particular purpose and then re-grant those funds to the sponsee for that particular charitable purpose. What's different here is the sponsored project lives within a separate legal organization, so the sponsor has less liability and responsibility for it, although it still does need to make sure in that re-granting relationship that it restricts the use of the funds for the charitable purposes. So those are some of the basic definitions of fiscal sponsor and an outline of the two most common types. I'm now going to hand it over to Carl to talk a little bit more about the life cycle of fiscal sponsorship.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, everybody. Carl Taibl here. And what Jean said is correct. One of the reasons that you want to go into a fiscal sponsorship is not only for the 501c3 value, but also for us, the community initiatives, our mission pretty much is to provide the back office operation for these organizations to allow them to focus more on their mission. So a lot of this, things you'll be hearing about today, you'll be hearing about other things in addition to 501c3, like legal and insurance and so forth. But anyway, it's hard to believe that right now we're already a week into August and my team has already started to close the first month of our fiscal year. And for community initiatives, in my 2 years I've been there, the revenue has grown 88% to $62 million. And we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. So there's a lot of momentum there. And you can find out more about us and even apply to be sponsored at the URL listed here on my slide. But today I'm going to focus on a couple different things. So I'm going to focus on the sponsorship profile and also what happens when you onboard or at inception of an organization coming into a new sponsor. So I'm going to be focused mostly on Model A, the one Jean had mentioned as the primary model. And I'm going to basically share what it is and what it is not. So what it's not one size fits all. As Jean mentioned, there are several forms of fiscal sponsorship. And historically, fiscal sponsorship was designed for special short-term situations like raising money for an immediate cause. An example might be assist residents in Kentucky flooding. Today, some projects have a specific endpoint and others continue indefinitely. So whom is interested in fiscal sponsorship? Well, Jean covered this a little bit. It's typically projects that are not yet 501c3, but it also might be, as I mentioned before, a crowdfunding initiative needing some infrastructure or tax deductibility. It could be actually a for-profit or an LLC with a new charitable initiative seeking access to charitable funds. It could also be someone or an organization that's already a 501c3 or already sponsored initiative. It's common for organizations to outgrow or transfer from a prior fiscal sponsor. In fact, we had a couple situations exactly like that where the organization needed a specific level of insurance that the former fiscal sponsor wasn't able to provide. What? Well, the project becomes part of the fiscal sponsor's tax ID number. So that's the same for the staff. So moving to a fiscal sponsor is like merging in a way. The organization and the employees get a new TIN along with back office support, and you'll get the accounting and accounts payable, payroll, HR and legal. But with new tax identification number, now you can immediately fundraise tax deductible donations and more specifically, grants in states in which the fiscal sponsor is registered. And that moves into the next section here, why. So in addition to soliciting tax deductible donations and grants, sometimes states require registration if you're soliciting donations for a cause, even if online. So if you're targeting participants or a population of a certain area, the fiscal sponsor may already be registered in the states and countries where you're targeting. Each of one has different rules. And the initiative must register in that state if it's targeted for fundraising. So with the internet, this gets a little bit tricky. But at the end of the day, why you want to quickly fundraise and have a container somewhere to collect donations that are tax deductible. And although we talked a little bit about this, I'm going to also talk about what it's not. So for a Model A, it's not a fiscal funder or a fundraiser. So technically, the fiscal sponsors provide the back office operations, but we can't really provide like a working capital loan or a line of credit. At the inception, when you come on board for fiscal sponsorship, the project, and I might refer to this as the FSP, the fiscally sponsored project, usually has its own initial cash or net asset contribution. So most of these initial funds will remain in the custody of the fiscal sponsor's cash or fiscal sponsor project cash account. So the fiscal sponsor, it's a fiduciary. It's holding on to the funds on deposit for your project. However, most fiscal sponsors will take their fee percentage up front, ranging up to 10%, maybe even 15% if it's complicated like government contracts. So just as an example, if your project has $100,000 and you come on board as a fiscal sponsor, once you wire that money over to the fiscal sponsor, the next day the project has 90,000 or so on deposit. So that's how most Model A fiscal sponsorship agreements work. The fees are collected up front, either at the initial transfer or as they come in. So all revenue is subsequent to donations and grants and contracts. Going forward, after inception, the project will be expected to maintain a certain level of cash on deposit. So most often we suggest 2 to 3 months of operating expenses. And this is important because the project will need to continue fundraising. Again, the fiscal sponsor is not expected to be the fundraiser. That's the role of the project. And again, the fiscal sponsor is not a fiscal funder. So I'm just trying to get that point across there. So a couple other points really quickly here, more on who and what. So the project becomes part of the sponsor's entity, similar to a corporate department. So in this relationship, it's important to understand because the executive director now reports to the fiscal sponsor. So a fiscal sponsor is going to sign all contracts. They're going to issue checks. Basically, me as the CFO becomes the organization's CFO. The sponsor retains discretion and control over the funds. So again, the sponsor is in the driver's seat. There's a concept called pass-through transactions. These aren't allowed. So a pass-through transaction would be if you have a donor that wants to target a specific person, you can't have that money pass through and get targeted to a specific person. There's no personal benefit or inurement. We need to watch out for that. And again, the revenue from projects might vary significantly month to month. You'll have an annual budget, but the monthly fees can range from anywhere for 60% of what it should be to over 200%. So again, that's sort of the life of a fiscal sponsor. There's a lot of variability and a lot of fluctuation. Now, Gene mentioned Model A and Model C, and also this book by Greg Colvin, which you should make note of here. It's called Fiscal Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right. It's not very expensive. You can get it on eBay or Amazon. But Model A is the most common form over there on the left side. And this is where the fiscal sponsor project becomes part of the fiscal sponsor. So as you see in that box there, the sponsored project is now part of the sponsor's organization. And quickly on Model C, it's a little bit different because just part of the project becomes part of the sponsor. So pretty much the sponsor is going to be helping managing the funding sources. And again, we can answer some more questions on this later. I think Daniel will also cover this a little bit. What I want to talk about also is what, if you're a project, what you should ask a fiscal sponsor. So this is sort of like an interview. And we'll cover this a couple of times here during the panel. But one, quality reputation. Does the fiscal sponsor, what is the reputation? You could do some research, due diligence, ask for references. Breadth of services. What is in scope of your arrangement and what is not? The depth and breadth of the project served. So at community initiatives, we focus on social services organizations, but what type of projects is the sponsor sponsoring? Of course, the credentials of the management team and staff. You want to understand who you're going to be working with. And also understand if they have government grant management and reporting experience. And this is very important because there's government grants can come in different versions. You can have, like, of course, federal grants, but you could also have state grants, or you can have county grants. And then also the geographic footprint. We talked about this a little bit. You know, how many states are they? Are they international? Where are you going to be targeting donations? Where do the employees live? That's also very important. And then strong financial processes. You could ask for the sponsor's IRS 990 and audit report. Ability to provide additional tools. So you might want to ask, like, what else would I get as part of my arrangement? So, you know, do you get any software for fundraising? Do you get credit cards? At community initiatives, we have several fundraising platforms that we allow the projects to use to solicit online donations. And then communication, knowledge sharing. How often are you going to be communicating with the fiscal sponsor, or do they do webinars like this? How do they share knowledge? How are they going to help further your mission? And finally, successful track record. You want to understand what the is the fiscal sponsor growing or not growing, and what are the outcomes? How many projects have progressed to be 501c3? Now, the fiscal sponsor might ask you some questions too, so I put together a couple bullet points, check marks on this here. So the primary thing they're going to talk about is your net assets and cash flow. So like any other organization, we want to be sure that you have some viability and you're going to be able to sustain. And usually we talk about having 2 to 3 months of operating cash on hand. And that goes into sustainability. So for fundraising sustainability, is your fundraising sources one time or are they recurring? The credentials of the management team is sort of like an interview. We'll understand your credentials as well. And what's important, one thing we'll talk about is advisory board members. So each project, even though you're coming on board at a fiscal sponsor, should have its own separate advisory board. And then I'm going to ask the last 2 items, the credentials of the management team and the credentials of the advisory board. What are your not-for-profit skills, knowledge, and experience? That's what I call SKE. So a combination of the last 2, do you have like the correct wherewithal to sustain the organization? Mission alignment with the sponsor, we talked about that a little bit, but the fiscal sponsor is also going to ask you that, what are you doing? Does it align with our other projects? Compliance history, I want to be sure that you don't have any issues with compliance, particularly with selling products. A lot of times organizations want to sell t-shirts or things on the internet, and we have to be careful with unrealized or UBIT, business income tax. So unrelated business income tax. And then potential undisclosed liabilities. So is there any potential litigation, social media presence, and a successful track record? So again, those are just a couple things that if I was evaluating a new project, what I might ask. And I thought it might be useful to do a little flow chart here in terms of what is the onboarding process. We call this our pipeline, really. So it's going to take between 30 to 120 days in a normal course. So the normal course would start with an application. The project applies to the sponsor. And after that gets vetted and all the questions get answered, it moves on to the project sponsors, usually a board docket. There would be some approval. In our case, it's usually at the board level. Do we want to take on this project or not take on the project? And after that, and that's maybe quarterly. So that might be from 30 to 90 days. It depends on when the next board meeting is. And after that, then we have a final agreement, finalize the fiscal sponsor agreement. So you're sort of in a pending status. You're approved, but not yet signed. And then once the project signs the agreement, then now you're contracted, but not yet funded. And finally, the last part of this is getting a transition completed, wiring or sending the cash over to the fiscal sponsor. So that process could take anywhere from 30 to 120 days. Sometimes it takes longer if there's some unanswered questions. One more part here, I just wanted to cover some tips to success. So in this case here, it's important to communicate. And I have told folks that it's better to over-communicate than under-communicate. So it's important to avoid unilateral decisions. So an example would be a project that decides that it's going to declare a holiday because in our case here, we had one that declared Veterans Day as a holiday, but that wasn't a holiday for the fiscal sponsor. So we had to undeclare it and work with the project to rework everybody's timesheet on that. The concept of control and variance power, Danielle's going to talk a little bit about this, but again, in terms of control, we require timely submission of cash receipts and invoices. You can't hold on to things. And a negative cash forecast might require a discussion about a furlough or a payroll hold. And finally, don't risk bending the rules. So you need to follow the same rules. Everybody who's sharing the tax ID number is very important to protect the risk and on that. So you need to understand the boundaries. The fiscal sponsor bears the risk of contracts and contractors. Again, it's important to understand the legal and other responsibilities. And I'm going to hand the gavel back over to Jean so she could talk a little bit more about that area. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Very helpful to hear the perspective of a very experienced professional fiscal sponsor. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the key legal responsibilities of sponsors and sponsees that anyone contemplating this arrangement should keep in mind. And the first I already kind of mentioned and touched on, which is that the fiscal sponsor has to first determine that the sponsored project is is consistent with and furthers the sponsor's charitable purposes. And this is part of the due diligence phase that the fiscal sponsor should engage in on any project. And Carl talked a little bit about that, which should examine the project's mission, its founders, its steering committee, its past, present, and planned activities. Because as Carl mentioned, it's kind of like a merger or an acquisition. You know, they're bringing you onto their into their organization, and the sponsor is about to become responsible for the project. You know, it might be for a short period of time, it might be for a longer period of time, but you know, everybody needs to make sure this is going to be a good fit for the organization. And the charitable purpose alignment is a key part of that due diligence. So for example, if the fiscal sponsor is focused on the arts and their charitable purposes are confined to supporting the arts, it likely cannot fiscally sponsor a project whose aims are to end homelessness, you know, even if that is a very noble goal. So the key operative document for a potential fiscal sponsor to evaluate is its own articles of incorporation or certificate of incorporation, and specifically the purposes clause in it. Does it have broad purposes that can operate for any charitable, educational, scientific, religious, or other 501c purpose, or is it more narrowly tailored? It's always good to check. And generally speaking,
really quick, we need to launch a poll question real quick.
Oh, I was going to do that in about 2 minutes. Is that okay? Or do we need to do it now?
Lisa, you can answer that better.
Go for it, Jean. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll let you know. Thanks, Lisa. Generally speaking, the large professional fiscal sponsors like community initiatives will have really broad purposes that allow them to accommodate lots of different kinds of projects. But if you're a project looking to form a fiscal sponsorship relationship with a nonprofit that doesn't do fiscal sponsorships for a living, that's when you really want to double check that your charitable purposes are aligned. And usually the fiscal sponsors board, I think as Carl walked through in that timeline, will have to give that final approval of charitable purpose alignment and approval. Additionally, on the charitable purposes front, because fiscal sponsors are usually 501c3s, I know there are some 501c4 fiscal sponsors out there, any sponsored project they take on has to abide by all of the restrictions that 501c3 organizations have to live with. So these include requirements that the funds are not used for prohibited political campaign activity, that lobbying activities can only be insubstantial, and if the project is going to engage in lobbying, the project will need to track and report lobbying activities within certain limits to the fiscal sponsor, so the fiscal sponsor can report them in the aggregate across all projects to the IRS on its IRS Form 990 Schedule C. I think as Carl alluded to, there can't be impermissible private benefit or private inurement engaged in by the project. Nor can the project engage in activities that are illegal or violate public policy. And as I get to later, these requirements and prohibitions should be articulated and enshrined in a clear fiscal sponsorship agreement. Okay, before we get there though, I want to talk about the level of discretion and control that a fiscal sponsor needs to exercise over the sponsored project and the funds donated to the sponsored project. So I guess the question is, can a fiscal sponsor simply just take a project in, agree to receive donations for the project under its 501c3 status and EIN number, take its administrative fee cut, and just pass the project on the money onto the project and call it a day? Well, the short answer is no. The IRS has a concept called step transactions where even if there are 2 steps, say donor gives to fiscal sponsor and the fiscal sponsor gives to the sponsored project, if they really are just 1 step and it's really just donors giving to the fiscal sponsor, but really the fiscal sponsor is not exercising any control over those funds and just passing them on to the project, they will collapse that transaction and really view it as just going from the donor to the project. And the project, as we mentioned before, does not have tax-exempt status. So essentially they could revoke the donation, the tax deductibility of the donation. So anyhow, what the IRS says is you can't just be a mere conduit or a pass-through. This is what you want to avoid. So how do you avoid that? Well, there needs to be a there with respect to the fiscal sponsor so that it isn't just a mere funnel. So the fiscal sponsor needs to accept the funds into its own financials and books and records that it controls and accounts for. It should report those all on its Form 990, and Daniel will probably talk about this more. And this is even true for Model C, even if you're going to re-grant the funds. Additionally, and this is a key piece Carl alluded to, while the funds are often purpose restricted for the restricted project, the charity needs to have language in its fiscal sponsorship agreement, and it usually needs to let donors know as well that the fiscal sponsor has the ultimate discretion and control over how those funds are ultimately deployed. And what that means is if it turns out the project is no longer furthering the charitable purposes and activities that they said they would be engaged in at the outset, or say they want to use the funds for prohibited activities, the fiscal sponsor needs to have the discretion and control and the authority to redirect those funds away from the problematic sponsored project and to other charitable purposes or recipients. And in most fiscal sponsorship agreements, this discretion and control language is called variance power language, which is something you want to see in all fiscal sponsorship agreements. Daniel may talk a little bit more about that, but you also want to have donors aware of this, because if you don't, if donors are not aware, they think they've created a restricted charitable purpose grant to you, and if you can no longer use the funds to support that charitable purpose, you may have to return the funds to them. So that's critical. So back to the fiscal agency versus fiscal sponsorship question. Agents under the law of agency have to follow the instructions of their principal. They don't have discretion and control to say, no, I don't want to carry out that activity. So that is actually kind of the reverse of the fiscal sponsorship relationship, where the fiscal sponsorship, the fiscal sponsor has that discretion and control. So I encourage you to stop using fiscal agent in your language and just stick with the fiscal sponsor language. The final key area of legal importance is making sure you have a clear fiscal sponsorship contract. You don't want to do this on a handshake. You want to clearly lay out the parties' roles and responsibilities in detail, as well as other key elements of the relationship. So a lot of this, it covers what Carl covered earlier, like what services will the sponsor be providing, what's covered by the administrative fee, how do charitable solicitations work, what language needs to be in them, and does the sponsor need to pre-approve solicitations before the project sends them out? How are the parties going to handle the signing of contracts and grant agreements? Who's engaging in the reporting to funders? What's that process? How's money dispersed to the project? What's the process for requesting, and what's the timing for getting funding dispersed? Employees, liability, and as we may talk about later, what is also the process for terminating the fiscal sponsorship relationship if it's no longer working out, or if, say, the sponsored project has graduated, they're ready to be their own 501c3 status. 501c3 organization. Does the sponsored project have their own authority to trigger that kind of a spin out or termination? How much notice needs to be provided? All of this should be enshrined in your fiscal sponsorship agreement. And finally, in addition to an agreement, oftentimes fiscal sponsors will have a fiscal sponsorship policy that kind of goes into all of these processes and procedures in more detail. And those are kind of incorporated by reference into the fiscal sponsorship agreement. But we really commend to you to spend a little time developing that agreement and those policies so that everybody's on the same page as to how the relationship is going to work. I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to talk about the financial and fiscal responsibilities of sponsors and sponsees.
So a lot of these concepts have already been discussed, so I won't belabor the point on them, and I'll try to cover just some nuances here from our perspective. The first item here has already been explained, that treat this like a merger, like an acquisition. You have to give it the appropriate due diligence. It's not something you take lightly and just say, oh, I'll take money on your behalf and it'll all work out. So embedded in that is understanding who you're working with. Ultimately, you're trying to protect yourself from liabilities that could arise and what situations could potentially create issues for you, or most importantly, what could impact your reputation as a nonprofit, which is one of the most sacred things that you have to value. The concept here around variance power, it's been touched on both by Carl and Jean in their discussion points. Variance power is just the technical term for who has discretion and control over the funds that are given to the nonprofit. And so, as was mentioned, typically what happens is the fiscal sponsor for those funds received by the nonprofit has the variance power in terms of the discretion on the ultimate use of those funds. Obviously, they have to take into account donor intent and restrictions that come with the gifts, but in terms of whether it goes to your project or some other equivalent initiative to satisfy the donor's intent will ultimately be up to them. So you're getting this concept of ultimately the control ultimately lies with the fiscal sponsor. Obviously, it's a very collaborative approach between the sponsored project and the sponsor, but that concept of variance power is important. If a donor does not give up its variance power, then that gets into the realm of agency transactions that Jean was mentioning in terms of giving up the right to direct the use of the funds. So that's something that's a term often used in the fiscal sponsorship realm, also with donor advised funds in community foundations. A lot of concepts around the 990 tax return were discussed. So obviously mission alignment, most important in terms of getting involved with a potential project. Jean covered that point greatly. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're a public charity, a 501c3 public charity, you have to maintain the public support test, which is something that generally demonstrates that you are supported by the broader public, not just a small group of donors. And so how is that going to impact your public support test calculations? Generally, more contributions from a broader group is helpful in that regard, but that's something that you just have to keep in mind as you evolve between having fiscally sponsored projects or reducing the number that you have. Obviously, organizations that work with hundreds of these like Carl and his team versus you're just going to do a one-off or just do a couple of them, a different set of considerations. Carl touched on the topic of UBIT, unrelated business income tax. That's a tax that you would potentially pay if you conducted some sort of activity that was outside of your stated mission, if it's a trade or business, a number of factors that go into whether something is UBIT or not. Just something to keep in mind so that you know what sort of activities that are going on. And then Jean touched on lobbying. Those are things that you typically have to disclose if you're conducting lobbying activities, and so you should be aware of what's being done by the projects you're sponsoring. Audits can be something you deal with regularly. If you haven't exceeded the $2 million threshold in California for requiring an audit, getting a fiscally sponsored project under your organization could trigger an audit requirement for you, or in another state that you have activities. The government grants that Carl mentioned also could trigger things like single audits. If you're dealing with maybe a project that is overseas or has overseas activity, maybe it could be an international or even domestic activity. It could be an international grant maker. A lot of times international bodies come with their own requirements for audits or accountability. And then obviously if you're growing your employee base, that could also trigger a retirement plan audit for you as well. International tax footprint, again, if you have something international happening in this relationship, just keep in mind that there are certain reporting requirements, and if you have employees overseas, it could create things like permanent establishment in a particular country, or even in the US, even if you just have some activities, there's forms that you have to complete around branch reporting for those activities. So just keep in mind what the extent of those activities are, and an analysis may be required. There's a few other points here, but I want to make sure to spend a little time on this project considerations. The only other thing is just obviously when you're coming up with budgets and cash flow management, you're going to need to understand what the process is with the projects in terms of you'll need to gather that information so that you can budget appropriately to your board. You have to allocate resources for cash flow purposes, understand again what their ability of funds to use are, and if there's something that could create a circumstance where you're needing to use your own funds, which is not an ideal situation. And then plenty of items on state and local tax compliance that you have to keep in mind as well. Some were already touched on. From a project standpoint, if you're evaluating a sponsor, obviously there were some questions that came in around governance and decision making. You have to understand the sponsor has the ultimate sort of fiduciary responsibility of it's their tax ID. Oftentimes they will work with the project and their governance structure of how they make decisions, but you have to kind of understand that relationship before you jump in. Again, the agreement, clarity on the agreement is definitely important, especially as you plan to exit as a potential separate 501c3. Potentially you may be incubating for a period of time and then apply for your own tax-exempt status. That's something you certainly want to be planning for. Other things like the infrastructure of the sponsor, right? They only have so many platforms they use for fundraising. They use banking relationships. They have accounting systems. So all those things are going to be useful to you, but also be limitations if you have certain ways you like to do things. Logistically, you want to understand that up front when potentially working with a sponsor. So those are kind of the key points that I wanted to mention, and save a little time for some of the considerations for Lauren.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, leaving the best for last, insurance. No, I'm just kidding. So we will discuss some key considerations regarding insurance and risk management. So at the end of the day, when we think about taking on a project, in the due diligence phase, you need to understand what that project is doing. And in that same effort, your insurance company needs to know as well, because they need to be insured. Every project needs to be insured. It's not automatically included in your coverage. It needs to be added at the time of when you take on the project. So I always recommend doing a little bit of pre-underwriting. Is that due diligence phase, taking account, what are they doing? What are the risks? Does it align very well with what we're already doing? And is our current insurance coverage going to automatically pick up the exposures of what the project might be doing as well? Or might we run into some trouble? Might they be doing something that is a stretch from what we're doing, or might be engaging in something that is seen as riskier than what we typically do? And is my underwriter across all different lines of insurance coverage going to be okay with that? What you want to avoid is adding something and having the underwriter come back and say, actually, that's out of scope. We cannot do that. So what we need to do is place an entirely separate insurance policy. That insurance policy might be cost prohibitive, and then the fee that you're paying to the fiscal sponsor is out of whack with what the insurance premium might be. So you need to be really careful with that. Other considerations is workers' comp in other states that the fiscal sponsor isn't in, and now you have a whole host of opening up a new business license and adding a workers' compensation policy for that state because your policy doesn't cover that state currently. So all these things. And then especially with non-property and liability related coverages, think about how hot cyber insurance is right now. If you have a fiscally sponsored project or multiple projects, like in Carl's case, 120, that's 120 websites, 120 domains that your insurance company is taking on. Is your policy responding to all of that? Make sure that you are including as much information as possible when you're going through the insurance process to make sure that the insurance companies know what they're doing. The other thing is that not all insurance companies will handle fiscally sponsored projects. So don't assume that the insurance companies you're with are okay with it. There's only a handful that really accept it and know with their eyes wide open about fiscal sponsorship. So many brokers and many underwriters do not really understand it. So there may be a lot of lost in translation that you need to clear up with your broker and then your broker with the underwriter. So clear lines of communication, and Carl mentioned this before, over communicate. It should be all the time that you're talking to your insurance representative about what these projects are doing, making sure that the underwriters also understand what they're doing and are okay with it. So another thing to think about is making sure you really understand your policy. Does your policy exclude certain activities? Make sure that you chat with your broker about what are the restrictions and the limitations of this policy to make sure that whatever my fiscally sponsored project is doing is not going to cause a claim to be denied if it gets to that. And then on the risk management side of things, which is not insurance. Insurance is when your risk management plan fails. So let's make sure that we have our risk management buttoned up, is that every project is part of the fiscal sponsor. So you need to make sure that your policies and procedures, trainings are all being trickled down to the project level. So if you require your employees who are interacting with children to be background checked and things like that, then your fiscally sponsored project, if they're dealing with youth, also need to be background checked. And all of the trainings that your insurance company might want to see. Are you running background checks or MVR requests for if they're in a driving position, sexual abuse registries, things like that. All of that needs to trickle down. So I see a lot of issues when there's turnover at the staff level that one might not know what the previous was doing. So making sure that there are clear lines of policies and procedures that are intact no matter who is at the helm for onboarding and offboarding. And one other thing is when a project gets offboarded, take it off of the insurance. Make sure that if you can get a refund for a project that is no longer with you, you get that. Also making sure that if you have large schedules of properties or autos, that you have things assigned at the project level, because it makes it that much cleaner when one comes off. Otherwise, if they spin off into their own 501c3 eventually, which happens often, they have to go now get their own insurance, and they have to have the background of what did the claims look like for the past 5 years. Well, if you then ask your insurance broker to send you all those claims, well, those claims are for every project that's on the book. So how can you delineate which was assigned to which project? So making sure that things are very clear and consistent are the way to go.
Lauren, there's a question here for you that I think maybe it would be helpful to just clarify. So the question is, so the sponsored projects still need their own insurance policies and are not under the umbrella of the fiscal sponsor, liability, D&O, and workers' comp? Maybe you want to clarify.
Correct. So no, the intent is that you are all one happy family under one big insurance policy. That is the goal. It doesn't happen every time, again, because possibly the exposure of what the sponsored project is doing is outside of the scope of what the underwriter is acceptable. But in a perfect world, and really the majority of the time, the projects come under the umbrella of the fiscal sponsor because they are part of the fiscal sponsor. So you should avoid multiple insurance policies if you can help it. Again, a lot of times brokers who don't fully understand how fiscal sponsorship works will automatically think that they have to place separate insurance for the project. Not the case. But the underwriter does need to know about the project. You cannot just assume that because you've taken on a project that it's automatically included in your insurance. You just have to add it and make sure that the underwriter knows about it. I also wanted to touch really quickly on D&O because a lot of board insurance, we saw a question here about, and I want Jean or Carl to talk about kind of the autonomy of advisory boards or boards of insurance or boards of directors for the projects. And then now when they come on to a fiscal sponsor, what happens? From an insurance perspective, it's really important that the insurance policy extends to advisory boards, has worldwide coverage in case the project might be in another country. So again, just knowing and understanding how the policy reads and what the limitations are and making sure it's as broad as possible to pick up that exposure is very important. Let me see if there's anything else that I had on here.
A great point, Lauren. I don't know if, Carl, you want to talk a little bit about the autonomy versus sort of control. You know, we've hammered away that the sponsor needs to have discretion and control, and the sponsor's board is the fiduciary board, but most of these projects do have advisory boards. You know, how much autonomy do you see given to advisory boards to oversee, say, the programmatic aspects of their projects?
Sure, yeah, I saw there was a question in the Q&A on this as well. So just to start off with, as Lauren and Gina mentioned, so when a project comes, Model A, for example, comes into a fiscal sponsorship, the board is now the fiscal sponsors board. So the board that the project had before becomes more like an advisory board. And so they can help operationally. So for example, they'll probably set the executive director's salary. They might approve the executive director's expense report or some other transactions, but they're more of an advisory role as opposed to one that has a board director level of authority. And Jean, you might want to elaborate further on that, but those are two things that I see mostly with the advisory boards for our projects.
Yeah, I think, I think the important thing to remember is, they can certainly advise and provide a lot of important advice, strategy, fundraising, a lot of the roles that a true fiduciary board would play, but they are still under the ultimate control of the overall sponsor's fiduciary board. And so, they cannot make those kind of ultimate decisions that the sponsor needs to make. So I think that's the distinction. But it's great to know, Lauren, that those advisory board members can still be covered by insurance because they are playing still an important role.